Hello, Professor. I will try to answer the three questions that you provided us. So, for the first question, I would say my computer is a MacBook Air M1, which was released by Apple in late 2020. It contains a M1 processor built on 5 nanometer process technology with around 16 billion transistors and 8 CPU cores. So, for high performance and for efficiency cores, this computer itself is a reflection of the progression of the Moore's law that you mentioned and the recent trend in CPU design. To give some perspective, back in 1971, the Intel 4004 had only like 2,300 transistors. In contrast, today we like the Apple M2 contain over 134 billion transistors and 24 CPU cores. That that's like a scale of growth of the Moore's law, which predicted of doubling like the number of transistor roughly every 2 years, captured quite well for decades. However, we are reaching physical limits of Moore's law. Transistors are now approaching 2 nanometers in size. Sorry, IBM demonstrated the 2 nanometer protocol in 2021, and Samsung planned to mass produce 2 nanometer chips in 2025, but shrinking like further towards 1 nanometer can introduce quantum effects like the tunneling. This is where like electron leak through barriers they normally shouldn't, almost like when the example that you gave us when students trying to squeeze them through the walls of an overcrowded classroom. This show us like clear perspective and limits of Moore's law. We can rely on endless shrinking and transistors to keep like boosting performance. Instead, modern processors are focusing on other techniques. One of the most important is the multi-core architecture. Instead of relying on a single core with the even higher clock speeds, which wastes energy and produces heat, designers now place multiple cores on a single chip. For example, my M1 has 8 cores, while the M2 Ultra has 24. Each core can handle like tasks in parallel, which increases overall performance and energy efficiency. Now, let me connect this with the components of a CPU. It contains like the arithmetic logic unit, which is called also the ALU, for arithmetic and logic operations. Various registers, such as the accumulator, for temporary results, the program counter to track like instructions, and the instruction register, which is also called the AR, to hold the current instruction. This also has the memory address register to and memory buffer register for communication with memory, and the control unit, also called CU, that directs all the activities. So finally, the modern CPUs has also like multi-level caches, the L1, L2, L3, to reduce delays when accessing data from memory. Together, these parts and their evolution, sorry, explain their incredible jump in performance, and when combined with parallelism through multi-core processor, they overcome the plateau of clock speed increases. In short, like the MacBook Air M1 is both a product of Moore's law and symbol of its limits, since it relies heavily on multi-core design and energy efficiency improvements rather than just raw clock speed. Now that I've discussed the Moore's law, the CPU evolution and trends through the lens of my own computer, let's move to the second question, which deals with how a CPU actually executes an instruction. To understand CPU operation, let's take a simple example, which is the instruction add 100. This means the go to the memory address 100, fetch the value stored there, and add it to the value currently in the accumulator register. Here is exactly like how the fetch, decode, execute cycle work step by step. So for the fetch, the program counter holds the address of the next instruction. The address is placed into the MAR, and the instruction add 100 is fetched from the memory into the MBR, then copied into the instruction register. Then we have the control unit, which decodes this instruction, and it recognizes that the operation is add, and the operation is stored at the address 100. After that, we have the execute part, which is the MAR is set to 100. The value at the location is fetched into the MBR and then set to the ALU. The ALU add this value to whatever is in the accumulator, which is the result stored back in the ACC. This cycle like repeats billions of times per second, allowing programs to run. Now let's add the concept of interrupt. Imagine that while executing at 100, the CPU receives an interrupt, for example, like the keyboard or from the disk drive. Here's what happens exactly. The CPU finishes the current instruction. It saves its state, including like the program counter and the registers, onto the stack. Then it jumps to the interrupt service routine, which is special code to handle the events. For example, if the keyboard generated an interrupt, the ISR might like with the keystroke. Then once the ISR is finished, the CPU like restores its state from the stack and continues executing at 100 or the next instruction in sequence. The interrupts are essential because they allow CPUs to respond immediately uh, uh, to important events without constantly like checking devices. They make modern multitasking and real-time response possible. We've seen how the CPU executes instruction, how interrupts fit into this process. Now let's move to the third and final question, which is what makes at 100 faster or slower than different processors, and which technology will shape the next decade. So the speed of executing an instruction like this one depends on many factors. The in the first, for example, let's start with the generations. In the first generation of the computers, like which used the vacuum tubes, this instruction would have taken milliseconds to execute. These machines were huge, power hungry, and unreliable. For the second generation, the transistors replaced vacuum tubes. These made instructions faster, measured in microseconds instead of milliseconds. For the third generation, integrated circuits, or also called the IC, allowed much greater speed and reliability with instructions times dropping into nanoseconds. For the fourth generation, which is the last one, the microprocessor put millions, then billions of transistors on a single chip, making instructions like add 100 effectively instantaneous, and also for the human scale, billions of them can run per second. But within the same generation, there are still different difference between processors. Like add 100 may be faster on the CPU than another because of the clock speed, which is higher clock speed execute more cycles per second. Cache size, if the data at address 100 is in the L1 cache, for example, the instruction will execute much faster than it has to go all the way to main memory. We have the bus width, which is a 64-bit CPU can move more data per operation than 32-bit one. The number of cores, for example, while adding the add itself runs on one core, having multiple cores allow many such instructions to run in parallel across different programs. Looking ahead, which technology we will have the biggest impact on the next 10 years. Uh, believe it will be the combination of multi-core processors and heterogeneous computing. We are reaching like the physical limits of transistor shrinking, but we can still improve performance by using like specialized processing units together. CPUs will work alongside GPUs for parallel tasks, and NPUs, like which is the neutral processing units for artificial intelligence. And this multi-core architecture is already present in my MacBook Air M1, which has both a CPU and a GPU integrated on the same chip. Over the next decade, this trend will accelerate, shaping the future of computer architecture, far from the simple transistors shrinking. In other words, like the story of the next 10 years is less about Moore's law and more about parallelism, efficiency, and specialization. Thank you.